The Earl of Thornmere did not look at her when he dropped it into her apron pocket. That was perhaps the cruelest part. Not the dismissal itself, but the fact that he never once looked. She had been at Thornmere Hall for 17 days. She had arrived with autumn mud on her boots and a letter of introduction from a seamstress agency in the village. Her name, as far as the household knew, was Phoebe Grant. Her father's name had been Grantham, Viscount Grantham of Thornmere, and the house she was now dusting and hemming in had belonged to him until 11 months ago, when a solicitor had come to the lodging house in Ipswich, where she was staying with a letter that said the estate had been legally transferred by order of creditors, and that she would receive her late father's personal effects within the fortnight. The seal and the effects had never come. That was why she was here. She had not expected the Earl to notice her at all. Men like Rowan Stanwick did not, as a rule, look at the women who kept their houses running. He was 34, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now something harder and more complicated. Not ugly, but not approachable. He had inherited the title and the debt together from a distant uncle he had never met. And from everything she could observe in 17 days, he had not yet decided what to do with either. He was in the library that morning, going through papers with the irritable concentration of a man who distrusts what he is reading, but cannot find the error. She had come in to return a set of curtain rings she had reattached. She set them on the side table and was turning to go when his hand swept something off the edge of his desk. It rolled across the floor and stopped near her foot. A small thing, silver, the size of a shilling. She bent to pick it up. "Keep it," he said, without looking up. "The agency hasn't sent your wages through yet. I was told there was a delay." She had not asked for wages. She had not said a word. She stood with the small silver thing in her hand, and he still did not look at her. And after a moment she put it in her apron pocket and left, because that was what Phoebe Grant, seamstress, would have done. She waited until she was in her room, with the door shut behind her. She was in the east wing, in a small room, with a window that looked out over the kitchen garden. It had been a storage room in her father's time. She had used to sneak into it as a girl to steal dried lavender from the bundles the old housekeeper hung from the rafters, and the old housekeeper had never once scolded her for it. She opened her hand. It was a thimble. Silver, the proper working kind, not decorative. Worn smooth on the cap from years of use. She turned it over to look at the band, and there, in small, careful letters pressed into the metal the way a jeweler does when a person wants something personal rather than pretty. E.g. Eleanor Grantham, her mother's name. Phoebe sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. She looked at the thimble for a long time. Then she counted steadily, the way her father had taught her when she was 8 years old and frightened of thunderstorms. She counted to 20. Then she put the thimble in the hem of her second stocking, tied it at the toe, and went back downstairs to finish the curtains in the blue sitting room, because that was the work she had been given for the afternoon. And she had decided, quite firmly, that she was not going to fall apart in a storage room in her own house. Her mother had died when Phoebe was 14. The thimble had been part of a small sewing kit, ivory-handled scissors, a silver needle case. The thimble, kept in a rosewood box on her mother's dresser for 20 years. Phoebe had last seen that box when she was packing her father's study after his death. It had not been among the things the solicitor catalogued. She had assumed it was lost in the confusion of the estate being wound up. She understood now that it had not been lost at all. She was awake before the house that morning, as she had been most mornings. She had learned in 17 days that the best time to move through Thornmere without being noticed was in the hour before the cook came down and the kitchen lamps were lit. She had grown up in this house. She knew where the third stair creaked and where the corridor narrowed behind the east wing door. She knew that the study, where her father had kept his private papers, was now used by Mr. Crewe, the estate steward, as his office. She had not yet found a way into it. Mr. Crewe was a lean, pleasant-voiced man of about 50, who had appeared at Thornmere 2 months after her father's death, recommended by the same solicitor who had delivered the letter about the estate transfer. He had a way of appearing in doorways when you did not expect him, and of asking quiet questions that sounded like conversation but were not. He had looked at her oddly on her 3rd day, a long, considering look that she had met with perfect blankness and which she thought had not been repeated. Mrs. Vickers, the housekeeper, was 61, broad, and had been at Thornmere since before Phoebe was born. She had stayed through the transition because, as she told Phoebe in the kitchen 3 days ago, with her hands around a mug of tea, someone had to make sure the house did not fall into complete ruin, and it was not going to be her that let it happen on her watch. She had not recognized Phoebe. That had been the first test, and it had held. 14 years was a long time, and Phoebe had been a child. She had her father's dark coloring and her mother's small hands and a face that was harder to place than she had feared. But she had been careful. She was still being careful. The document she needed was in that study, the one that would show whether her father's will had been altered or simply misread. She was certain of it. Her father had been meticulous. He had kept copies of everything, filed and dated and indexed in the old green cabinet that had stood in the corner of his study since before she could remember. That cabinet was now Mr. Crewe's. She was going to need a way-in that did not require a key. The village of Thornmere Cross was 1.5 miles down from the hall, and Phoebe had been going to it 3 mornings a week on the pretext of collecting thread and notions for the household sewing. In practice, she spent most of those hours in the back of Mrs. Dunphy's dry goods shop, doing alterations at 4 shillings a week, and listening. Mrs. Dunphy was a small, watchful woman of about 60, who had known the previous housekeeper at Thornmere Hall and had opinions about the new steward that she expressed to the back wall of her shop rather than to any living person's face. She had taken Phoebe on after watching her put in a blind hem without being asked for the technique, and had never inquired where Phoebe had learned to sew. It was in Mrs. Dunphy's shop that Phoebe first heard the name. Not the Earl's debts. Those were the subject of grim and continuous village talk, discussed the way a flooding river is discussed, as a fact of nature, impossible to ignore and impossible to stop. She meant the older debts, the ones held by a private bank in Edinburgh. A farmer named Geddes came in for rope and said, without being asked, that the surveyor had been out again to the north pasture, and that it belonged to Karen and Sutton now, had belonged to them for the past 3 years, and that the rest of the land wasn't far behind. Karen and Sutton, Phoebe said carefully. The Edinburgh Bank, said Geddes. They held the old Viscount's paper, and they hold the new Earl's the same way. Between them they've owned every stone of that hall since before the last man died. She went back up the hill that afternoon with a new piece of information sitting very quietly in her chest. Karen and Sutton. She knew that name. Her grandfather had founded that firm. He had started as a clerk's son with no money and no connections, and by the time he died, 3 years before her father, he had built it into one of the most solvent private banks in Scotland. He had left his share of the firm to her father, who had no head for banking, and had sold his interest back to the junior partners within a year. Or so the solicitor had told her. She thought about that for the rest of the walk. She had been at Thornmere Hall for 5 weeks when Mr. Crewe found her in the study. She had not meant to be found. She had gone in on a Wednesday afternoon when he was away at the tenant farms. and she had 20 minutes at most before the cook sent someone to find her for the pressing work. She had the green cabinet open. The lock was the same one it had always been, and she had known the combination since she was 12, and she was going through the third drawer when the door opened. He stood in the doorway. He was not supposed to be back until 4. He looked at her and the open cabinet and the papers in her hand, and he was very still for a long moment. "Mrs. Grant," he said pleasantly. She set the papers down. She did not put them back. She turned to face him. He closed the door. He came and stood by the cabinet and looked at what she had been reading without touching it. "You're looking for the will," he said. "The copy your father kept here. There were 2, you know. The original with the solicitor and the copy he kept himself. The solicitor's copy has been amended, I suppose you'd say. This one hasn't." He smiled at her. It was a kind smile which made it considerably worse. "You have your mother's hands," he said. "I noticed the first week. I was surprised how long it took me to place you." "How long?" Phoebe said. "Third day," said Mr. Crewe. "Perhaps the 4th." She understood then that she was in a great deal of trouble. He told her, in that same pleasant voice, that she would leave the study and say nothing about what she had found, or he would go upstairs to the Earl and tell him that the seamstress had been discovered going through private estate papers connected to a property claim already settled in the courts. He would also mention, he said, the thimble, which she had taken from the household effects without permission. "That thimble belongs to me," Phoebe said. "Can you prove it?" he asked. She could not yet. She left the study. She went down the back stairs and stood by the pump in the kitchen garden until her hands stopped shaking. Then she went to find the piece of blue sarge that needed finishing by Thursday, because there was nothing else she could do in that moment, and at least the sarge would get done. She said nothing to anyone for 4 days. On the 5th day, Mr. Crewe went to the Earl. She was in the sewing room when it happened. She heard his voice in the corridor, low, regretful, the tone of a man compelled by reluctant duty, and then the Earl's voice, shorter and harder, and then a long silence. When the Earl came into the sewing room doorway, his face was the kind of control that costs something. "I'm told you have been in my private papers," he said. "Yes," Phoebe said. She did not explain. She did not have enough yet, and she had learned in 5 weeks that the Earl did not have patience for a story he could not see the end of. He dismissed her that afternoon. In the front hallway, with Mrs. Vickers and the cook and 2 housemaids and the bootboy all present, because Mr. Crewe had suggested, with his usual quiet efficiency, that household matters of this kind were best handled openly so that no one could be under any suspicion. He said she was to take her things and go, that no reference would be provided, and that he was sorry but that no position in his household could be extended to someone who had abused the trust placed in them. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Phoebe bent down and picked up her basket. She walked the length of the hallway with her back straight and did not look at a single face. She heard Mrs. Vickers say her name, very quietly, just once, from somewhere behind her. She kept walking. It was raining by the time she reached the gate. She slept in Mrs. Dunphy's back room on a narrow cot, and Mrs. Dunphy sat on the end of the bed without saying anything until the shaking stopped, and then brought tea and still said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do, and Phoebe knew she would not forget it. The village did not believe the dismissal for 1 single day. That was what Mr. Crewe had not accounted for. He had treated Thornmere Hall as a contained world, a thing that could be managed from inside a locked office. He had not thought about what 5 weeks of a woman doing good quiet work does to a village of 200 people who have been living under the shadow of an estate that does not look after them. Mrs. Dunphy knew. Geddes the farmer knew. Mr. Farrow the schoolmaster knew. Phoebe had spent 2 afternoons sorting his predecessor's disorganized records, and had done it without making him feel the chaos had been his own fault. The woman whose boy's coat she had mended without being asked knew. The family at the edge of the village whose surveyor's letter she had translated knew. Because what she found in that letter had saved them from signing away 3 acres they hadn't realized were included in the clause. A paper went around the village by noon of the second day, nearly 80 names, and 14 of them crosses, because 14 of the people who signed it could not write but wanted to be counted anyway. They took it up to the hall. Geddes delivered it himself and waited while the Earl read it in the entrance hall, standing in front of 3 servants who were all pretending to be somewhere else. The Earl read it through once, then again, and then folded it and held it for a long time without speaking. It was Mrs. Vickers who broke Mr. Crewe's cupboard. She arrived at Mrs. Dunphy's shop on the evening of the 3rd day, with mud on her good boots and a bundle of papers under her arm, and said only, "I have been in this house since before you were born, and I know which locks have no good reason for being locked." She set the bundle on the table and sat down and looked at her hands. The papers were from the green cabinet, her father's unaltered will, exactly as she had known it would read, and underneath it 7 letters from Karen and Sutton in Edinburgh, all addressed to Mr. J. Crewe, steward, Thornmere Hall, the earliest dated 3 months before her father died. The letters described a private arrangement. Her grandfather had not sold his full interest in Karen and Sutton when her father disposed of his share. He had retained a 5th, held in trust for his only grandchild, to be passed to her upon her marriage or her 25th birthday, whichever came first. The solicitor who had handled the estate, the same man who had arrived in Ipswich with the transfer letter, had been Mr. Crewe's brother-in-law. The trust had never been disclosed to Phoebe. The share in the firm that held every mortgage on Thornmere Hall belonged to her, had belonged to her since her grandfather died. It had been sitting in Edinburgh for 3 years while she lived in lodging houses and hemmed other people's curtains. She sat in Mrs. Dunphy's back room with the letters in her lap and understood, all at once, and with considerable clarity, that the Earl had been given the same false picture she had been given, by the same man, and had trusted it because he had been given no reason not to. She was still deciding what to do with that when his horse came down the lane at 7 the next morning. He stood in the road with his hat in his hand and said, without preamble, that Mrs. Vickers had told him everything she knew, and that he had spent the previous night reading his estate papers with a rigor he should have applied years ago, and that he had ridden to the magistrate at first light. "He has the documents," the Earl said, "the altered will, the bank letters, the correspondence between Crewe and his brother-in-law, and he has Crewe, who was taken at the coaching inn before dawn with £400 sewn into a coat lining." Phoebe came out into the road. The cold had a particular quality that morning, the kind that comes just before the first hard frost. "There will be a hearing," the Earl said. "The magistrate says within the week. I want you there." "Why?" she asked. He looked at her and did not look away. "Because your name was spoken badly in my hall in front of 6 people," he said, "and whatever was done to you was done in my name, even if I didn't know it. I won't fix it privately. It has to be corrected in the same room it happened in." "You didn't know," she said. "No, but I didn't look, either." He was quiet for a moment. "I had a steward who told me the estate was managing, and I chose to believe it because looking would have meant understanding figures I've always found inconvenient. That isn't a defense. It's just what happened." She looked at him for a long moment. He was thinner than he had been when she arrived, and his coat had been mended at the elbow by someone who was not. She noted professionally, very good at it. "The hearing," she said. "I'll be there." The magistrate, Sir Geoffrey Brant, a practical man who had known her father, declared the most sensible venue to be the front hall of Thornmere Hall itself, since the documents in question all pertained to the estate. 11 people were present: Mrs. Vickers and Geddes and Mrs. Dunphy and Mr. Farrow, who had walked 4 miles in the rain that morning because, he said when asked, someone ought to. The Earl stood before Sir Geoffrey and said everything. He said he had dismissed a woman from his household on the word of a man he should have verified, and that the dismissal had been public, and that a public wrong required a public correction. He said he had failed to examine his own accounts for 3 years, and had signed what was put in front of him, without reading it. He said these things in a level voice, without flinching, in a room full of people who had watched the original dismissal happen in the same spot, and who were now hearing themselves be believed. He laid the documents on the table and asked that each one be read aloud. It took 20 minutes, and it was the longest 20 minutes the hall had known since her father's time, and at the end of it the room was very quiet. Sir Geoffrey confirmed that the altered will was a forgery, that the solicitor and Mr. Crewe would face charges at the assizes, and that the private trust, the 5th share in Karen and Sutton of Edinburgh, was Phoebe's lawful property and had been since her grandfather's death. He said nothing about the house. That was for her to decide. She stood up. She held her father's original will, and she thought about what she wanted, which turned out to be a different question from what she was owed. She knew what she was owed. What she wanted was harder and more specific. "The estate will go into proper trust," she said. "The accounts will be opened quarterly to the trustees and to the firm in Edinburgh. The repairs to the tenant cottages will be drawn first, before the household, before the stables, before anything else. The north pasture that was transferred to Karen and Sutton reverts to the estate, since the trust document makes clear those acres were held against my grandfather's arrangement, not against the Earl's debts." Sir Geoffrey wrote it down. She turned to the Earl. He was watching her with an expression she did not yet know well enough to name, something between attention and something older and more complicated. "I'm not returning to Thornmere Hall as a seamstress," she said, "or as anything else for the moment. I have a share in a firm I've never seen, and papers I haven't read, and a grandfather whose name I knew on a thimble before I knew it in a document." She paused. "You may write to me if you have questions about the estate accounts, or the repairs, or anything pertaining to the trust." "And if I write about something else?" he said. She considered that for a moment. "That depends on what you write," she said. He wrote the first letter within the week. It was 3 pages and almost entirely concerned with the North Pasture boundary dispute. She replied with a precise note about the relevant clause in the trust document and nothing further. The second letter mentioned, in its final paragraph, that Mrs. Vickers had been given a substantial raise in wages and had responded by informing him that the east corridor plastering had not been properly done since her father's time, and that she had told this to 4 successive occupants of the house, and not one of them had listened. He had, he wrote, sent for the plasterer. She read that paragraph twice. By the 5th letter, he had stopped writing about the estate altogether. He wrote that Mr. Farrow's school now had 37 children, and that a girl from the Geddes family had a gift for mathematics that the schoolmaster said he had never seen in 30 years of teaching. He wrote that the kitchen garden had been expanded, and that the cook was unreasonably pleased with herself about it. He wrote that he had learned, slowly and with considerable help from the Edinburgh firm, to read a balance sheet, and that he had prepared the quarter accounts himself, and found 4 errors in his own work and marked them without correcting them, because he wanted someone to see what they were. Phoebe sat with that letter for 2 days in the Edinburgh office she had been given when she took up her grandfather's share in the firm. With a portrait of an old man she had never properly known on the wall, and her mother's thimble in a glass on the desk where she could see it when she looked up. Then she sent for the carriage. She arrived at Thornmere Hall on a Thursday morning in December without writing ahead. The hall was exactly as she remembered it: the gray stone, the long drive, the kitchen garden on the south side, different and the same, more repaired than she had expected. The Earl was in the front garden, arguing with a man about fence posts. And he looked up when the carriage came through the gate, and the argument stopped entirely. She got down and walked toward him. He came to meet her. They stopped a few feet apart in the cold December light and looked at each other. "You didn't answer the letter," he said. "I answered it this way," she said. Something moved in his expression. She filed it away to think about later. "The balance sheet," she said, "with the 4 errors. I want to see it." "I'll have it brought." "Good." She looked up at the house and the plastering estimate. "Also brought." "And," she said, "I want to look at the kitchen garden." He walked beside her to the kitchen garden, and the fence post man stood, watching them, go with his hat in his hand and the expression of a person who has accidentally witnessed something private and is uncertain what to do with himself. Her father's old espalier pear tree was still against the south wall, leafless now, but the framework had been properly tied in for winter. "Someone knew what they were doing," she said, touching the tie. "Mrs. Vickers found a book," he said. "She says your father used to manage it himself." She had not known that. She stood with her hand on the branch and thought about a man she had known as a father and had not known as a gardener, and the not knowing had a particular quality now. Still present, still real, but no longer sharp enough to cut. 4 errors, she said, in the balance sheet. Yes. Show me. They went inside. Mrs. Vickers brought tea twice that afternoon, and the plastering estimate, and the balance sheet, and said not one word about any of it, except that the kettle was not to run dry, and that she would know if it did. Phoebe worked through the figures with a pencil, and the Earl sat on the other side of the desk and learned, carefully, and without hurrying, what she was showing him. He was a slow student, but not a bad one. He asked the right questions, and when he did not understand something, he said so directly, rather than pretending, which she had not expected. The thimble was on the desk between them. She had taken it out of her coat pocket when she sat down, and he had looked at it and said nothing, and she had not offered to explain. Late in the afternoon, he picked it up and turned it over. "E.g.," he said. "My mother," she said. He set it back down. He lined it up carefully with the edge of the inkwell, the way a person does when they want to be precise, and that is the only precision currently available to them. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," she said. They were quiet. Outside, the December light was going out of the sky. Mrs. Vickers could be heard somewhere above them, delivering her views on the plastering estimate to the upper housemaid in a voice that was not intended to carry and carried perfectly. "The 4 errors," Phoebe said. "2 of them are in your favor." He looked at her. "Is that good?" "It means you're not misreading in only one direction," she said. "That's important. It means you'll get better at it." He looked at the page again, and the slight shift in his expression was something she decided to file away and think about, at some point, when there was more room for it. She stayed until the light was entirely gone and the lamps were brought in. She stayed another hour after that, because there was a discrepancy in the November rents that wanted resolving, and because Mrs. Vickers had produced a covered dish from somewhere and left it on the desk without comment, and because Thornmere Hall, in December, with a fire lit and the plastering finally seen to, was, if she was honest with herself, considerably more like home than an Edinburgh office with its portrait and its correctly organized files. She did not say so, not yet. She stood up and went to put on her coat. When she came back, he was still at the desk, with the balance sheet in one hand and the thimble in the other, and he looked up, and she saw him understand that she had left it there deliberately. "Tomorrow," she said, "if you have the North Pasture Survey ready." "It will be," he said. She buttoned her coat. She looked at the desk and the papers and the thimble in his hand, and she said, "Because it was true, and because this was the right place to put it. My grandfather spent 30 years trusting no one and died with letters his daughter never read. I have decided not to do things that way." He said nothing. He just looked at her, careful and steady, the way a person looks when they understand exactly what is being offered and know they have not yet earned it but intend to. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. "Phoebe." She went out into the December night, and she did not correct him, and she did not look back, and the thimble stayed where she had left it. There is a small glass box now on the mantelpiece in the Thornmere Hall library, the kind used for displaying things too small and too particular to hang on a wall. Inside it is a silver thimble, worn smooth on the cap, with 2 initials pressed into the band. Guests ask about it occasionally. It is, as objects go, not valuable, not by the library's standards, not by anyone's. It is simply the smallest and oldest thing in the room, and it has the best position, and no one who knows the house ever moves it.